Hello and welcome to the video version of the Happier at Work podcast. My guest on today's episode is Caroline Collins, and we talk all things workplace culture. So a topic after my own heart. Caroline has a PhD in workplace culture change. So we have such an interesting conversation about all of the different aspects of it. What does workplace culture actually mean? We talk about expectations and feedback and how culture is not just the responsibility of HR. I really hope you enjoy today's episode. Do let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Caroline, you're so welcome to the Happier at Work podcast. I know you're a long-term listener, a long-term fan, so I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. And I'm trying to even remember how we connected in the first place. I think it was like a random connection on LinkedIn, maybe. But we had a conversation.
Your LinkedIn post.
Yeah, we had a conversation, and you just couldn't shut the two of us up when we got into a conversation. So it was brilliant. Just a really nice alignment of values there, I think, as well. So do you want to explain a little bit about your work history and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. And thanks for having me on. I'm having that moment of long time listener, first time caller.
Yes,
to a radio show. My background is originally in psychology, and I was always interested in how people's behavior impact different parts of their lives. And it was probably always going to end up in business somehow. But I went on and did a doctorate in culture change. And I think there's a lot of learnings from that can be applied to now, the world of work. It's funny, when I started in my career and I was in my 20s, nobody knew quite what to do with the whole concept of culture and humans and working together in office. And it feels that post-pandemic, that conversation has really taken off, where we're talking about the culture piece, we're talking about future work, we're talking about how people can be the best of themselves and bring the diversity piece, their full selves to work. So it feels like finally it's come into its own. I've worked in HR for over 15 years at this stage. So everything from the public sector right the way through to startups and tech, mostly with a feel on health, biotechnology and pharma. But I also worked in management consultancy in the financial services sector. And to me, the massive learning and takeaway is the commonality. So yes, sectors are different. Some of them are regulated, some of them are not. Obviously, your commercial focus is different, but people showing up to a place of work, and now whether that's in a brick building or virtually, what they expect from work, how you motivate them, how you engage them. There's such commonality, I think, for as long as we're working with people, that's really the piece that excites me.
So is it to say really that we're all humans, and no matter where you're showing up to work on a day-to-day basis, be that in a physical office, wherever you go to work, or whether it's signing up or signing in virtually, that we're all people at the end of the day. And
yeah,
it's really understanding that across the board it's all the same, and it's understanding, and we'll get into that now in a second. I think this idea of using psychology and understanding human behavior and applying that in the workplace to, I was going to say, to get the most from your people, but that's not just about what it's about. It's about getting the most from your people, but also creating that environment that people themselves are really happy to work there, that they feel motivated, that they feel fulfilled by the work that they do. And at the end of the day, the business sees results at the end, as a result of that.
Yeah. And none of us just check our personalities or our stuff that might be going on in life or at home. We don't check that in a bag in the morning when we log on or when we walk into an office. And so some understanding as to how does that play a role? How does that motivate us? How does that impact performance for good and sometimes for bad? All of that understanding is important. What's interesting is that the transactional piece of companies getting the most from their people has very much changed in my experience over the last five years in particular. I think some of that is linked to COVID, some of it is linked to millennials and Gen Z coming into the workplace, and some of it has just linked to, I think, more sophisticated conversations around how do people work best, and that can't just be a one-way street. And I think the differentiator of good companies, good company culture versus those struggling to get talent, the ones who really get it, who really want to inspire and motivate their people, who want their people to show up and equally get something from the business as much as give to it, those are the ones where the really good talent want to work and where they stay.
And I suppose, thinking about it, brilliant that there are some companies that are getting it right, but how do people find out that they are good places to work, I suppose?
That's the real challenge. And I was thinking, I was being a total nerd getting ready to chat to you today. I was thinking, could I think of even one part of the employee life cycle, from talent attraction through to onboarding, through to how you do performance management, to development plans, succession planning, the full spectrum of it, even how you offboard somebody whenever they choose in their career. And I can't think of a stage in that life cycle that culture doesn't impact. The challenge is, how do we find out? And it always strikes me, people go on Glassdoor, but your happy people never end up on Glassdoor. The people who go there more likely than not because they have had a poor experience. In some respects, okay, that's their prerogative to share. It doesn't necessarily help an employer brand because all of your happy staff aren't the ones talking on Glassdoor. So really, how we leverage our networks, how we link in with people who work in the company or who previously worked in any company, the questions you ask at an interview, because again, recruitment has become so much more of a two-way conversation of fit. So, it's what can I bring to the company, but what can they do for me? And, millennials are really, really good at that. I've had interviews where people have walked in with a list. And you get to that question at the end of the interview, go, so do you have any questions for me?
I've
Like,
actually
wait a second.
prepared
And they
something.
whip
Let
out a
me
list.
just
You're like,
get
oh,
it.
whole new level. But I think we're getting
In
better
case
at
I
those
forget anything
conversations.
that's on my list, I've
Oh yeah, and literally, and this very really impressive woman worked her way through it, and she had about 10 questions, and we're like,
yeah,
okay, I can see that you've thought about this,
yeah.
um,
But that's,
and
I
that wasn't
think,
off-putting. That's impressive,
I was about to say, just to take a pause on that's what you want from candidates, that they've done enough research that they know vaguely what the organization is like to work with, that you've looked at the website, you've seen what they say their values are,
Yeah,
but you've done like beyond that, like getting someone in a room and having the opportunity to speak to someone who works there and ask them questions about what is the culture like and how do
yeah,
people get recognized. And we're not going to dwell on talking about what specific questions you could ask. I'm, as a slight aside, I'm thinking of, for the podcast and the future of the podcast, how could I create tools based on each episode that could help people? And
mm,
maybe that's a tool that I can create. Here's a list of, I was going to say 100 questions, maybe 100 is too many, but something like
yeah,
20 or 50 questions that you pick and choose, and they're very generic and you need to tweak them slightly to your own situation, but
yeah,
that you can use in an interview situation to gauge whether or not somewhere is the right place for you to
mm,
work. Because like you
yeah,
say, it is a two-way street these days. It's not all one way of you're there to be interviewed and to show that you're the best person for the job, but it's
yeah,
really to a mutual understanding of, this is the problem that you're here to solve, and are you the right person to solve that problem,
yeah.
and is this a good fit, are you going to really thrive in this environment?
Yeah. And I know you're a data nerd like me, but if you think about, every single part of the recruitment process gives you data. So how do they set up the initial call?
Oh
Are you
yeah.
given flexibility on days of the week? So there are still, and I know from previous experience when I was in and out of different cultures, but also talking to friends, there are still some companies who will say, well, the interviews are on Monday afternoon. And if you can't make it on a Monday afternoon, we'll just move on to the next candidate. That
Wow.
tells you something.
Yeah,
That tells you
that
something
tells you
about
you're a number.
flexibility. That
Yeah,
tells you something about how they value people,
yeah,
whether interviews are online versus in person. So how open are they to hybrid? If you're saying, well, I have childcare arrangements, I can't travel in person, could we do the initial hello, how are you virtually? Is that a yes or a no? Are you greeted when you arrive? Walking into any business's reception tells you a huge amount about who they are. And
mm,
not the kind of fake, I have, 4 icons. We've all seen that, right? So the icons of the values stuck on the wall, and you
yeah,
kind of just
yeah,
look and
yeah,
go, the latest set of them. But actually, how are you greeted? Are people talking to each other? Are people
yeah,
slumping around looking like they're carrying the weight of the world? Versus, do people look happy to be there? And that's the piece where I think, once you plug the part of your brain in that is, culture is everywhere, and it's not the policy that's written in the drawer, it's
yeah,
how work actually comes to life, how people behave, how they're recognized, how they're valued. And you start seeing that from the minute you start in a recruitment process right the way through to even at the end, how you're offboarded. All of
yeah.
that is important.
Brilliant. I was having a conversation with someone quite recently, and I don't really remember how this came up, but it was the idea that, and just me kind of flippantly saying that when you are in that situation and you are looking for a job, and I've been there, that you're kind of, desperate is the wrong word, but you're kind of, you have that feeling that I don't have that many options, and maybe then your spidey senses are a little bit less perceptive to things that you may have noticed if you were in a comfortable position already. And I think maybe that's a challenge for some people when they're in an environment where they're like, listen, I have to get out of here and I have to get out really soon. It makes it much more difficult to find something, aside from the fact that you're feeling a bit burned. And I've been, like I say, I've been there. You're kind of looking for something new, but you've had a terrible experience in the past and you don't want to make that same mistake again. I think that's just another layer that people need to be aware of, that if you're looking for something, you need to make sure that it's really the right thing for you and that you're not making kind of rash decisions, that you've done your homework, that you're asking all of the right questions rather than being afraid to ask those questions in case it unearths something that you don't want to hear because you're so kind of keen to get out of the situation that you're in at the moment.
And I think it's not just you. If I look at people I've worked with again so I do a lot of mentoring and coaching, and people generally, but women in particular, coming back after mat leave, career pivot points, if you're changing direction or if you're moving from that first role where you've been maybe a manager into becoming a leader. There's lots of places. So for sure, job searching is one of them. But there are also lots of points where people nearly feel trigger shy. And a lot of the coaching and the conversation I have with people is how do you recognize and sit with the fact that you're trigger shy, and whatever experience you've had, whether it's a poor employment experience or you've been out of the workforce for a reason, or lots of people now take, carrying responsibilities and they're going back or they're changing careers post-pandemic. Recognize it, sit with it, but then also free up a part of your headspace to see, okay, how do I truly create kind of space to hear my gut instinct? Because in my experience, if I look back at the things that have gone well and gone badly, and certainly I don't think anyone has a career where everything's gone well.
No.
It's your gut instinct steers you. And I think when you allow space to hear that and, see what's around you in that process, that you're better positioned. So I think some of the time it's just about hitting the pause button. I'm a woman who doesn't know how to hit the pause button usually well. So I'm talking to myself as much as anybody else.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. That's brought up a few things for me now. This idea of like, they're kind of pivotal change points where you don't want to rock the boat and you're kind of afraid to speak up and maybe ask the questions that need to be asked, or like you say, to really listen to your gut. And one of the previous podcast episodes with Kelly Thompson, she was talking about women in particular. We're so used to suppressing how we feel that be that in lots and lots of different scenarios, that you don't really know what your gut is. You're not trained to listen to it. And really, if you take that pause, if you really take time to practice listening to it, then it won't steer you wrong. But for any, I'm probably butchering the entire episode now, but Kelly had a really nice way of explaining that. So I'll put a link to that previous episode in the show notes. But yeah, like that, we've basically been ignoring our gut for so long that it makes it really hard to get back into the habit of knowing what it is and being able to trust it as well.
Yeah, and it's funny. I heard that episode as well, and it's in my timeline. It came up on the back of a quote that Meryl Streep had of women have learned how to speak man for decades. We have had to in order to exist, whether it's in the corporate world or in her case in show business. Men have not necessarily learned how to speak women. Some of them do, not all of them. But I think because we're so used to morphing into that shape that fits the expectation, we don't always pay attention to what it is that we want or need in career paths. And I think an awful lot of the career planning and the development piece, women in leadership, all of that diversity area now focuses on, okay, it's okay to ask for what you want. And yes, you can ask in a certain way, but you have to be clear yourself, because that's how you get motivated. That's how you get to be truly passionate about a job you love. And then you show up and you give your best and you're valued, and all of the good stuff follows.
Brilliant. Caroline, I'd love to come back and talk to you a bit more about the doctorate research that you did around cultural change. What were the kind of key insights that you found?
I suppose the one thing that strikes me, and it's easy to say, is that we don't all love change. We're humans. I get very suspicious of people who, and again, culturally, so North America versus Europe versus APAC, people will talk about change differently. I always get a little nervous. People go, oh, I'm changed. I can't wait. I'm just so up for you. Kind of go, oh, okay. If you put me in front, so I've done some really big change management programs with different businesses. And the ones who are up the front, who tend to be the gung ho of, I'm so up for the change. I'm here. And a lot of lingo and slang kind of comes with it. And they tend to take up lots of space. You know, there's a certain personality. They kind of make me nervous because as people, we do like a certain degree of consistency. We like to know what's
Mm.
going on. Change can be challenging. And yes, all of the cliches hold, the really interesting stuff happens outside of your comfort zone. But does anybody really sign up for, the 40, 50 hour week, thing in their life that pays the bills and keeps the roof over their head for that just to be upended? I'm not sure. Never
Yeah.
really convinced that people sign up for that. So when I'm leading a change program and you see a group of people, it's not the ones down the back who have already decided that this is the worst thing that's ever going to happen to them. So not them. It's not the ones at the front telling you how to do it and they're so down with the plan, they're there ahead of you. It's the ones in the middle who look a bit curious. They're the people, I think, where real change conversations can happen because they're sitting being honest, saying, okay, could be good, might be bad. I just want to find out some more. They're the ones who'll have meaningful questions. They'll be the people who become your best change ambassadors.
Yeah.
So I kind of pick my middle crew and go, okay, these are my people and we can work together on whatever the conversation or in change
Yeah.
is.
I love
Um,
that. I
but yeah,
don't know, Caroline. Sorry,
people
go
are
on.
messy. I'm not sure any of us truly love change. We might embrace it. It's that whole, learn how to surf rather than be afraid of the waves. You can put all of the, the posters up on the walls, but we are still human, with all of the flaws.
I think I'm a bit anti-change myself. I like so sorry. No, I'll rephrase that. I love continuous improvement, but
Yeah.
like big change projects that I've been involved in, I say involved in, use that lightly because it's more been at the receiving end of in an organization, not consulted, just like here's the change that we've already decided to make at a global level. Now go and roll it out.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult. And like, especially when you don't agree with the change that's been rolled out. But
Yeah.
what I was going to say a second ago, Caroline, have you seen the meme where it says, who wants change? And everyone puts their hand up. And then who wants to change? And no one puts their hand up.
All
So
those hands come down.
we want
Yeah.
other people to change and to kind of fit our mold and to fit our way of doing things. But
Yeah.
oftentimes we're reluctant to make those changes for ourselves.
Yeah.
So brilliant, really interesting about culture change. And I suppose maybe culture more generally speaking, I'd love to get your perspective on the different organizations that you've worked in over the years and whether it's been a culture change project, which I'd be really interested to hear about as well, or just generally speaking culture. What do you see works well, especially kind of going back to our earlier point of it's really, we're all people at the end of the day, and it's about understanding our behaviors and what motivates us and what helps us to feel fulfilled at work and to do our best work to feel happy, while at the same time being in line with that organization and that organization really succeeding as well.
Yeah, I think there, go back to your meme, there is the cliche of, culture is how we do things around here. And I think that is the best summary I have still to date heard.
Yeah.
It's not the policy in the drawer, it's how it comes to life. And it's everything from, is it okay to ask questions? Is it okay to make mistakes? When change, you describe change being done to you or at you as against a conversation happening. That's culture. Culture is how do we give feedback? So I know when I worked with some of the tech businesses, a lot of them were really keen on a continuous feedback loop for performance. And that's a really great idea. But it unearthed questions around who legitimately can give feedback and how do you make sure that feedback is useful? Because we've all sat in those performance meetings where they're just soul destroying and you walk out 2 feet tall thinking you're the worst person on the face of the planet. And an awful lot of the time, that's about how the manager or the leader has given the feedback rather than the substance of the feedback. It's that piece where what's the difference between feedback versus gossip? Because if you look up one of the indicators of toxic culture, for example, one of the in all of this, the Harvard Business Review, Forbes, all of the research around it would say, gossiping in an office setting, kind of above and beyond the normal kind of human level of interaction, is one of the indicators of toxic culture. So when does feedback stop being feedback and when does it start being gossip? I think those are really intricate questions that managers and leaders need to ask themselves. And that's the piece around your leadership impact, your communication style, how you bring culture to life in a really meaningful way for people. So it's that full spectrum of what is it like to be in a company? So if I'm in sales, what does success look like? If I'm looking at career planning, what culture do we have around what is a stretch objective? What does good look like if we talk about a high performing culture? How do we support people through mental health or diversity or caring responsibilities? How do we onboard new job starters? And that came up a lot in the pandemic, of people starting their first job remotely, where the first conversation they had was probably how you do a flat pack desk, because there was nobody else. I spent half through COVID, I seem to
And who
spend
can I hire to do this for me?
yeah, and they're not going to come, by the way, because there's lockdown. So I did spend a good 6 weeks in the middle of COVID talking to people about how to put together desks. I thought I was moonlighting for IKEA for a while. But all of that is the piece around culture, and an awful lot of the issues, the points of friction, where either I've been brought in on a project or I'm coaching somebody and they raise issues of poor experiences they've had. An awful lot of those points of friction come down to differential expectations of what do I need as the employee versus what am I getting, and manager or leader capability. And I'm still not sure that culture and inclusivity and really good, strong communication and empathy are things that we train for in leaders. And I think that's something that could have a real impact as we move forward.
There's so much to unpack there. So much to unpack there, Caroline, that I'm curious about, and I want to ask more questions. Can we start, first of all, with this idea of feedback? Who should be giving feedback, and how can we make feedback a bit more useful, and performance reviews? Now, I don't want to kind of dwell on this whole thing of performance reviews. That can be a topic for a whole other podcast episode.
Yeah.
But I suppose just boiling it down and sharing an insight from my own experience, that I had a manager who didn't rate me at all. Like, I mean, we just had this terrible relationship. And I went into the performance review and he gave me not a glowing review, but definitely way better than I thought. And it made me think that he just didn't want to have that conversation with me about why I wasn't performing. And that was on him. Like, maybe I'm totally wrong about that, but that's the impression I got at the time. I was really surprised, but also happy that he had given me this positive performance review, for want of a better word, rather than a totally negative one, which was what I was expecting.
That's really interesting, because I think when any of us have gone through performance reviews, you get the sweaty hands. You go, oh my God, I'm going to have to talk about myself, and that's just awful. But the piece that we see much less often is that managers very often feel uncomfortable, because there is that moment of even giving good news. So Irish people are awful at taking compliments. So even how do I tell you in any kind of impactful way that you've done a good job?
Yeah.
Oh no, sure, what are you talking about? And you kind of go, no,
Sure,
actually you need to
anyone can
sit with
do
that and hear it. Yeah. And so we don't love giving good feedback, but we also then get very uncomfortable at talking about development. And I think a lot of it depends on what kind of experience you've had. We all have our own baggage of the most excellent leaders who have sat with us, who have made us better people. And I think for me, and I can think of one who I worked with and she was amazing, I knew her intent was positive. So she was coming to me with, here's stuff you're good at, keep going, grand. Now, here's stuff you can do differently. And it didn't feel personal. I didn't feel like a bad person leaving that conversation. I felt like somebody believed in me, they wanted better for me, and they were going to help me figure that out. But it's because we came from that foundation of, we knew each other, we had stuff in common, there was a baseline relationship, it was filled with respect. And I knew, even if she had a foot and mouth moment, because we're all human, it was still a case that her intent was positive. And it was kind, and it came with that kindness and empathy, and those, we call them softer skills, when actually they're quite hard to deliver some of the time. But that nearly got us through any kind of difficult conversation. And I think sitting, when I talk to leaders and do work with executives, an awful lot of it is about that, of you're human, the person you're talking to is human. You have to kind of realize that it's not you going in with a clipboard and ranking people. And don't get me started on, you're a 1 to a 5 or an A to an E in terms of rating people.
But then
it's
the
having the
forced
conversation
rankings as well, Caroline, like well, we can't have too many people getting a 5 rating, because that, not everyone is a 5, and then comparing people to each other, like, just horrific. And like, that is on my list to do a whole other separate solo episode all about performance reviews, and kind of pulling the curtain behind and sharing some of my own experiences as well on that, because I think it's so important. I'd love to come back to this amazing boss that you had and ask, did Like, how did you know that her intent was positive, I suppose? Because I think a lot of us think that we're going into these conversations with positive intent, or maybe the intent is, listen, I just have to get this over with. I have to deliver this terrible feedback that is not coming directly from me. It's actually on behalf of someone else. And it's just really awkward. What made the difference for her that you knew that her intent was positive?
I think so her name is Julie, and she'll die of embarrassment because we're still friends, and that's a testament. We've worked together in 10, 12 years. She made a point of getting to know her team as people. And
Yeah.
that meant, and I don't mean in the false way of, oh, do you do yoga on a Friday? But she actually wanted to get to know us. What do you want? What motivates you? And she shared, here's where I'm coming from. Here's my background.
Mm.
You know, she had recently moved home. She was in a new relationship. She brought herself to work. So there was a baseline of we're people and we want to get to know each other. She also has this really nifty knack of being direct without being harsh.
Yeah.
So there was no messing around. You knew if she told you it was good, it was good. If she told you it needed to be done better, it needed to be done better. So she didn't mince her words. And she also said she verbalized a lot of what was in her head. So she would start by saying, I want the best for you. Here, I think you can do better. Here, so all of the unspoken stuff that you're sitting in a room with, she actually put words on. And then over time, obviously, that develops trust and respect, and you see her delivering that for herself. She is somebody who sought out feedback about how she was doing. So it was a true kind of two-way conversation. And I think that's how very quickly she established her credibility, where Julie could land the worst news possible, whether it was about a client account or something that had really, really gone wrong, and it would still be okay. And she
Mm.
made a point, I think, of following up afterwards, and she minded the relationship because we're going to have to do this tomorrow, so there's no point in people going home so horribly embarrassed or so horribly broken that they physically don't want to show up tomorrow. Or the Sunday night blues test of, are you sitting on a couch on a Sunday racked with, oh my god, I can't go back to work? That's kind of a test of culture. Or do we all get to be okay coming back to working together the next time around? And
Yeah.
that's where she invested such huge time and energy. So yeah,
Love
I think
that.
she's a rock star. I'm a
Yeah.
fan.
If you're listening today.
Yeah.
um, Brilliant. I love that. And some really practical tips, I think, for people to take away on what it really means to be a leader. Because, like you were saying, we're talking more broadly about culture, but actually, the really important piece to that is the leader's role. And a big crucial
Mm,
part of the leader's role is the development of the staff. And a big crucial part of that is feedback. Now, something else, Caroline, that you mentioned in relation to that is feedback versus gossip. So, what's feedback
yeah.
versus what's gossip? And gossip is a sure sign that you're in a toxic work environment. And I've been in that situation where there's gossip, and even like finding out that people were gossiping about me. Or here's a prime example
Mm,
where I went to speak to someone who was a colleague and came back to my desk and found what's the word, an instant message that was very obviously meant for someone else, but the
oh,
person got confused and sent it to me by accident, which
oh
was,
no.
yeah, and to read something like that, it was, the implication was that I was trying to throw someone under the bus, when, so obviously they had taken my intention to be completely wrong, and but then took it upon themselves to start spreading that gossip around, just literally just after having the conversation.
Mm,
So yeah, it was. So
not
yes,
good.
gossip. Back to gossip.
Gossip, back to gossip. I think, there's a certain piece where once you put people in a room, we're going to talk about each other. So there's a level of social interaction that you wouldn't want to kill. I'm not advocating for politically correct work environments where nobody says anything ever. I think to me the difference is, and I'm sure this won't necessarily be the most popular view. Some of the new HRIS tools or online systems where people can give an instant shout out to colleagues, and this has been lauded as the way you build real engagement and the way you give real time motivational feedback. They make me a little nervous because if anybody can talk about anything any of the time, I guess the question becomes, how do you then equip people to do that responsibly? So it's great
Yeah.
if and one of the systems I think has you can give a colleague a high five for doing a good job, or you can give them a shout out for doing a good job. The notion that notionally, theoretically, that's super. Practically speaking, it becomes fodder for some of the behaviors we would have seen when we were in school. So, if you're always getting the high fives or the shout outs and I'm not, am I left out? Does that mean I'm ostracized?
Yeah.
Is it that my work is less visible? Is there favoritism at play? I think it unearths all of this, for want of a better word, stuff around human interaction. I think, to me, feedback is very clearly defined. If you're in a leadership position, if you're working on a project cross functionally, if you are a peer and you have something to say, be it good, bad, or indifferent, it needs a structure. You need to put a scaffold around what is feedback so that there are parameters that everybody understands. They might not like them. We don't have to love stuff in order to be clear on it, but there needs to be kind of a safe space and a scaffold around feedback. And if it is not that, then it is something else. And if it's and chances are it's something like gossip. So if I'm talking about you as a person and I have no legitimate reason to, if I'm not talking about the work that you've done or your skills or capabilities or how you added value, if that's not what I'm doing, I think a conversation needs to be had, and ideally by a leader, to say, what's going on here? So
Yeah.
what tone are you trying to set and why? Do you understand the impact it can have?
Mm.
And to me, gossip is one of those things that you kill really, really quickly,
Yeah.
quite unashamedly, because it is the piece that can run away and become really, really damaging in a culture. And we need to be really clear, that's not feedback, that's just gossip. And it's at the nastier end of the spectrum where I think some direct conversations need to be had.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things I'd love to pick up on there. This feeling of being left out, or like, why am I not getting any of the high fives? Why am I not being recognized? My work is becoming less visible. I never thought about that from that perspective. Now I've seen it in action where we used to recognize people for living the values, and I'm kind of like, someday I'm going to get recognized. Why am I not being recognized? Is it because I'm in
Yeah.
a leadership position and I can't? Which in itself is kind of ridiculous. It's like, you should be able to be recognized just in the same way that everyone else is recognized. But that's a really interesting kind of nuance to those technologies where it
Mm.
can make people feel a little bit left out, a little bit like they're being excluded if they're not getting that regular recognition, and if people are kind of grouping together almost and forming that. And kind of building on this point of gossip and killing gossip quickly, I suppose it's hinging on the fact that you know about it in the first place,
Yeah.
that you catch someone in the act, or that you're the recipient of gossip and you can safely share that with someone else who can do something about it, or just simply say, I do not want to take part in these kinds of conversations that goes
Yeah.
against our values of respect as a business.
Yeah. And I think, to me, so HR hat on, when I'm working with a business, that's where I like to be really close to the business so that I have visibility of how things actually are on the ground. So that myself or a HR team are close to them. I think that's kind of your functional responsibility. Our responsibility as any adult working in a workplace, if you hear gossip, it is up to you to be the
Yeah.
one to close it down. If you're hearing it and it's not comfortable and you think about, well, if I heard that said about me, how would I feel? if
Yeah.
if all of that doesn't go well, then you have a responsibility. I think that's one of the core values you can bring to life, going back to that conversation and culture, where your expectation of people is, if something doesn't sit well with you, if it's not right, if you don't think it's fair, if you wouldn't want to be the recipient of it, nobody's going to come and save you. You're standing there, you're the one who has to speak up. And I think that's a really good sign of a healthy culture when people can do that.
Yeah, that was another point that I wanted to come back to, is this idea of expectations. And I love how you described it as it's this idea of how are my needs being met as an individual, and what are my expectations of how those needs are being met. And I think oftentimes a big source of unhappiness is the differential between what we expect something to provide, or how we expect something to be, and how it actually is. And so if we can set those really clear expectations about what it's like to work here, what it should be like to work here, bridge that gap if there's a gap between what we want it to be like and what it actually is like.
Yeah.
But then this idea of having managers and leaders who are capable to drive that, to have those conversations, to set those really clear expectations, to nip it in the bud if there's anything that is untoward, for want of a better word. So things like gossip and just people not living in accordance with the values of the organization.
Mm. I think there's two things to pull out in what you said. The first is the unspoken. So
Yeah.
to me, the big piece is, unless it's next week's lotto numbers, in which case, by all means, we should share them. But, there shouldn't be mystery in this process. So
Yeah.
overall in work, it's the unspoken. It's about making sure that there is less unspoken stuff, that people are clear, because that's where expectations can be out of kilter. Because I have this set of things I expect. I haven't said them to anybody, they're in my head, but I
Yeah.
expect you to fulfill them nonetheless. And when you don't, I feel bruised. It's a case of naming them and for there to be dedicated or allocated space in the conversation for that. So I think take away the mystery is step one. The other piece, and it's I have an agenda structure, so anybody who's worked with me will know I structure our kind of catch up agendas, the good, the bad, and the awkward. So you talk about the stuff that's gone well, the stuff where, there's challenges or deadline hasn't been met or something has been done differently. And then you specifically put an agenda item called the awkward. And it's where you bring the stuff that nobody wants to talk about. And it's the cringy stuff if I saw this thing happen or I wasn't comfortable with how this got. But by naming it and allocating time, if we can sit here for 10 minutes and we can be quiet, or we can use the time to fill and we can chat and we can be the awkward, is where people get to bring their stuff. And I think that's how you establish psychological safety and trust. It's where you expect, irrespective of seniority or experience or otherwise, people can bring issues that are sitting poorly with them, have a conversation, it stays in the room. And that's where you begin to unpack, okay, is my expectation out of kilter? Is this the kind of company we are? Is this thing that we've seen not aligned to values and therefore we need to address it? Was this just a one-off because, Bob is a great guy and he's lovely. He was just having a really bad day. And we
Yeah.
kind of need to check, is he okay? But it still wasn't right. So having that space and naming it as awkward, I think gives people permission to say, okay, you're not going to love this part of the meeting. We're still going to do it. It's going to be awkward for everybody, but we're going to be better for having done it. I think that's
Yeah.
important.
I love that as a framework or as an agenda. Just
It can be
like
fun.
making
What people call
space.
awkward can get interesting, but yeah,
Making space for those awkward conversations, because I think you hit the nail on the head, Caroline. It's taking the mystery away, isn't it? It's less of the unspoken. And we sometimes assume that people can read our minds and
yeah,
that our expectations are really clear. Now, I'm learning more and more about this as I bring people in to work with me on my business, that I assume that people would just look at what I've done previously and just know how it gets done. But that's not the case. Like it takes effort, it takes time to explain to people. Like I have tools that help me to do that, which is brilliant as well. But taking away that unspoken, or at least having those things in place where it's really clear what the expectation is. And I love talking about expectations when it comes to productivity and things as well. So setting
yeah,
really clear expectations around time and quality that is expected. And I think if we just get that out on the table rather than assuming, like, I think, and I'm thinking back again to some instances where it's just you start in a role and it's almost like sink or swim. You
yeah,
have access to the intranet to do a bit of research on the company and the different departments and what they do. Maybe you have some meetings with the departments, but they're kind of meaningless because you're not really sure what your role is in the organization
yeah.
yet. And like the expectations are not really very clear at all. And I think that just continues as you do your role. You learn on the job and you create your own expectations almost.
Mm. Yeah, and I think we're really good at asking very senior leaders, and it's become that, politics cliche that's transferred over to business of what will you do in your first 100 days? And I nearly cringe when I hear it because you're like, well, the first 30 you're going to
Listen.
say nothing and listen,
Yeah.
hopefully remember your own name. Um, but we're really good at asking them what they'll do in their first 100 days. We don't necessarily cascade that down. So one of the things I've worked on with teams is within the first 2 weeks of anybody starting, they should know, they should get KPIs or OKRs or whatever it is you're working to.
Yeah.
There should be a list. And maybe one of them is get to know the company or go buddy up with somebody and find out about whatever the project is or whatever the area of work is. But from the start, it should be clear if this is what good looks like. You won't know it from the start. We will help you and equip you and support you to get there, but you should be really clear where you're pointing, because
Yeah.
none of us can be good if we don't know where we're going. It's, that's like me heading out without Google Maps. I'd be doing circles around Athlone. So it's more, I think, naming it and being clear and making sure it's attainable. So there can be all of the stretch stuff, but even within somebody's first month, and I think there's a reluctance for, oh, you can't set annual KPIs when somebody's in the door. Of course you can. You tailor them and you tweak them so that they have a
Mm.
roadmap. And
Yeah.
that takes out some of the mystery. It also means you can have a concrete conversation of stuff that's on track and off track, and you're not having the vague conversations. So how are you settling in? Where, how do you even begin to answer that question? It can be a case of, have you buddied up? Have you sat with somebody on the project? Do you know where the stuff you need to do your jobs or the online tools? Do you know where that is? What do you think you can bring? What's your expectation of what you're going to get from
Yeah.
your first month? Ask the question. I think that clarity is important from day one and sets the tone. And it implies really clearly that it's okay to want to be clear, to ask questions, to figure things out.
Yeah.
It sets a space where from the start, you know that that's a good thing.
And it allows for ramp up time as well. Like you're not
Yeah.
expected to come in and hit the ground running in a new organization when you don't know the people, you don't know the systems and things like that. But something occurred to me as you were talking, Caroline, and that is asking people who are new to a role for feedback as well,
Yeah.
and like, how are we doing? And have we given you enough information to be able to
Oh,
do
yeah.
your job or to set you up for success or to onboard you properly?
Yeah.
All of these things I think are so,
But I
so
come back, that's
important.
gold dust. And I think the good companies, again, positive cultures, come back to where we started. Really good companies get that. That's feedback you can't buy because all of the team that's been there. So it takes about between 9 and 11, but average about 11 weeks for a dominant culture to kind of take over your newbies. So you can
Mm,
take a new person or a new team, embed them in an organization, and 11 weeks later, whatever your dominant culture is, they will have begun behaving like that. And that is proven time and time and time again. So you lose that window within the first 3 months of people having that external lens. If you make
yeah,
a point of asking people at day 5 and at week 5 and at week 9, I think are good kind of sensible data points that I've used. How are we doing? Not about you, but how are we doing? What can we do more? What can we do better? How
yeah,
did we live up to our promise? So you read this job ad at one point in time, you chose to come and interview, you got the job, brilliant news, we all celebrated. Have we lived up to that? And if not, is it better, worse, different? What's going on? And I think, companies pay a huge amount for market research and net promoter scores and employee surveys, and all of that is really useful. But there's a wealth of information sitting within their new starters while they still have that external lens
yeah,
that lots of times we just don't ask for. And to me, that's
yeah,
just a massive waste. And I think that's
yeah,
where you can show your people you're valued, you value them, and you're listening to them from the start.
yeah. And I was told, and I'm sure I've covered this on the podcast before, but that's not how we do things around here. That's what I was told
Yeah.
when I was bringing some new ideas, some fresh ideas into the organization. That's not how we do things around here. And I was like, right, I don't think I ever open my mouth again. Um, you know,
Yeah.
it just
That
puts you
that's soul
off, I think.
destroying. Yeah.
It is, yeah.
Um,
I'm like, okay, so this global experience that I've spent years building up is not valuable where I am. So that's good to know.
yeah.
Caroline, we've kind of covered lots of different ground, but all relating back to this topic of culture.
Mm.
Any final thoughts, or is there anything that we haven't necessarily covered on culture that you'd like to get across in the podcast today?
I think the thing that strikes me, no matter what the size of the business I've worked with or where it's based or the sector it's in, is that there's been massive progress in that we are now talking about culture. And that's that, tick that box. It's brilliant. And that isn't something I would have spotted 7 to 10 years ago. There still remains an awful lot to do around what we mean by culture, because it's become one of those words that we throw around with future of work. And we're all saying it. I'm not convinced we all mean the same thing. And I think investing time in working out what do we mean, what do we want, what works for us, because one culture will work for a business and for a set of employees and it won't work for another. And everybody can find their place in some role where they add value. But cultures are different and they need to be. But I actually think investing the time and unpacking that and exploring it and seeing how do we line up our culture with our commercial objectives, with our people objectives, and make sure everything is leveraged to best capacity is the next stage of bringing it to life, I think. And as we look to future work and what company success looks like.
Brilliant. I love that. And you had um, that kind of famous quote earlier, the cliche as you were talking about, like culture is how we do things around here. Like I
Yeah.
love that as a culture. And maybe you don't have clearly defined values. That's okay. You still have a culture though, because it's how
Yeah.
people are doing things. And if they're not checked, if people are not being pulled up on what is perceived as a poor behavior, then you're going to find yourself like slippery slope into gossip and toxic culture,
Yeah.
basically.
And
So
it's
really,
everybody's
really,
business. HR isn't the culture
yes,
police. I don't
exactly. It
come with a
is.
Wonder
Yeah,
Woman
yeah,
outfit.
yeah,
It's more that it's everybody's responsibility. But that being a shared objective and identifying it as a shared objective, I think, is the next iteration of employee engagement and employee experience. It's about being more explicit about investing time and resources and energy and culture.
yeah. I love that. Brilliant. Caroline, the question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast, and you'll know because you're a long time listener, what does being happier at work mean to you?
I think for me, it's recognizing that that has changed over time and being okay with that.
Mm,
And for me right now, it's making sure that I can add value to your point on, you've gotten this wealth of experience, but you're still only halfway through a career. So how do you make sure it's useful? Um, and having that space where you can be yourself and make the positive difference, but still learn. To me, that's the happy zen zone of adding value, but also still being able to learn and grow and develop. That's happy to me.
I love it. And if people want to connect with you, if they want to find out more about you and what you do, what's the best place they can do that?
They can find me on LinkedIn where they'll find all of the work stuff. If they're interested in year-round swimming or sunsets, they'll find me on Twitter or X. I'm at Coffee and Swim, but mostly LinkedIn is where they'll hear all about the culture and HR stuff.
Brilliant. Love it. Thank you so much, Caroline, for your time today. Absolutely loved this conversation. And there's so many practical things that people can implement straight away after listening.
It's been really good, Aoife. Thank you.